Imagine boarding a flight expecting a smooth journey, a routine trip, and suddenly, everything spirals into chaos. What happens when power, prejudice, and entitlement collide at 37,000 feet? On Flight 812, Elijah Grant, a composed, insightful, and profoundly grounded black CEO, finds himself confronted not by turbulence in the air, but by turbulence in human behavior. A flight attendant slaps him. A fellow passenger escalates, and the cabin becomes a stage for confrontation and injustice. How could a simple boarding procedure become a national headline? Why do some people wield authority without accountability? And what happens when someone refuses to be diminished by fear or bias? Elijah's calm demeanor masks an inner storm of reflection, strategy, and ethical decision-making. As the aircraft hurtles through the sky, so do questions of morality, systemic bias, and human dignity. This is more than a story about a flight. It is a story about courage, justice, and the quiet strength required to navigate a world that often misunderstands or underestimates you. Can one person's poise really shift the course of an entire system? Stay with us to uncover the full journey of Flight 8112, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss this powerful story unfold. The cabin lights had just dimmed. Passengers settled into their seats as the Boeing 787 climbed through clear skies. It should have been an ordinary morning flight from Los Angeles to Chicago. People opened laptops, scrolled through phones, flipped through magazines. The steady hum of the engines gave the impression of routine, comfort, predictability. But in row 2 first class, something shifted. Elijah Grant sat quietly, a leather-bound notebook resting on his lap. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm presence that drew little attention. To most passengers, he looked like a businessman on another trip. They didn't know his name carried weight far beyond this cabin. Elijah was the CEO of Global Airlines, the very company operating this flight. The irony would soon become unbearable. A flight attendant, Melissa Carter, approached with a tight smile. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, her uniform crisp, but there was a sharpness in her eyes. She had already moved briskly through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks. The man seated beside Elijah had received a glass of wine in real stemware. When Elijah asked for sparkling water, Melissa returned moments later with a plastic cup. It was small, subtle, but noticeable. Elijah didn't comment. Years of experience had taught him to pick his battles. He thanked her, lifted the cup, and quietly sipped. Across the aisle, Naomi Lee, a 25-year-old law student, noticed. Her phone hovered just above her tray table. She had been live-streaming parts of her trip for her modest online audience. Naomi's eyes narrowed. She had seen that kind of micro-difference before, little gestures that said some people deserved more and others less. She started recording, not expecting the footage would change her life. Melissa returned again, leaning down toward Elijah. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat? First class is reserved?" Elijah blinked slowly, his calm expression never breaking. He reached into his jacket, produced his boarding pass, and held it out. "Seat 2A, clear as day, paid in full." Melissa glanced at it, her lips tightening. She didn't apologize. Instead, she turned sharply, muttering something under her breath. The words weren't clear, but the tone carried dismissal. Elijah breathed in, steady. His mind flickered back to childhood bus rides in Georgia, to moments when teachers doubted his abilities, to boardrooms where he had to prove himself twice over just to be treated as equal. He had mastered the art of composure, but composure came at a cost. It meant carrying insult after insult like invisible weights. Naomi adjusted her phone, whispering to her small audience. "Did you all see that same cabin? Different treatment. I don't like where this is going." The veteran in seat 3C, Henry Collins, adjusted his glasses. 78 years old, a retired history teacher. He had lived through Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, and decades of slow progress. His eyes followed Melissa, then rested on Elijah. He knew that look, the one Elijah wore. It was the look of a man who had been here before. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Passengers scrolled, read, whispered, but tension lingered in row 2 like static in the air. Melissa reappeared with the meal cart. She served the couple in 1A, a smiling duo who received salmon plated on china. Wine refilled in tall glasses. At Elijah's seat, she placed a foil-covered tray, the kind usually given in economy, sliding it onto his table without eye contact. Something inside Elijah shifted. He wasn't angry yet, but he felt the slow burn of disappointment. He whispered to himself, unheard by anyone else, "Not again." Naomi's phone caught it all. "This is unbelievable," she murmured to her live stream. "He's literally in the same cabin. Why is he being singled out?" David Morales, a corporate attorney seated 2 rows back, leaned forward. His trained eye caught details. Others missed the tone of voice, the differential service, the power imbalance. He began jotting notes on a legal pad. Elijah set the foil tray aside, untouched. His voice, when it came, was low but firm. "Ma'am," he said as Melissa passed by again, "could you bring me the same meal service as others in this cabin? I paid for first class." Melissa stopped, turned, and stared at him. "Sir, I don't think you should raise your voice." He hadn't. The cabin knew it. His tone was calm, respectful, but her words reframed him as the aggressor. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Something cracked in the air. Melissa leaned closer, eyes flashing. "I've had enough attitude." Then, with a suddenness that stunned everyone, her hand shot out. A sharp slap struck Elijah's cheek. The sound was loud, crisp, impossible to ignore. Gasps erupted. A woman covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Phones lifted instantly. "Recording." Naomi's stream surged with comments, hearts, shocked emojis flying across the screen. Elijah didn't move. His head had turned slightly from the blow, but his eyes were steady. He placed his hand gently on his cheek, then lowered it. His breathing was even, his expression composed, though pain flickered deep inside. He didn't retaliate. He didn't shout. He didn't rise from his seat. Instead, he spoke, voice quiet, but clear enough for the cabin to hear. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about what people think they can get away with, who they think deserves dignity, and who doesn't." The cabin went silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Naomi's phone vibrated wildly with incoming comments. "Did that just happen?" She slapped him. "Who is this guy?" Henry Collins closed his eyes, whispering to himself. He had seen ugly moments in his lifetime, but this one cut deeper. He wondered if progress was ever permanent, or if it always dangled on the edge of reversal. Elijah leaned back, shoulders straight. His inner monologue wrestled with questions. Should he press the call button? Should he demand intervention? Or should he let the cameras, the witnesses, and the truth speak louder than anger ever could? He chose silence for now. The tension was unbearable, a storm waiting to break. Every passenger knew this flight was no longer ordinary. Something had happened that none of them would ever forget, and no one yet realized that the man sitting quietly in seat 2A, the man who had just been slapped, was the CEO of the very airline whose logo adorned the plane's tail. Elijah Grant sat motionless in seat 2A. The sting of the slap fading, but the weight of its meaning pressing heavier with each second. His cheek warmed under the cabin lights, but his mind was elsewhere. He was not thinking about the cameras or the shocked faces around him. He was thinking about a lifetime of moments that had prepared him for this one. He remembered being 12 years old, walking home from school in Atlanta. The summer air had been thick, heavy with humidity. He had been carrying his science fair project, a carefully built model of a solar system that had taken weeks to create. A group of older boys intercepted him on the corner. They didn't like how he walked with confidence, didn't like how his shirt was tucked in neatly, didn't like how he seemed to believe he belonged. They knocked the project from his arms, stomping on the planets, crushing the careful orbit lines. "You think you're better than us?" One boy sneered. Elijah hadn't fought back. He had gathered the broken pieces in silence, carried them home, and rebuilt the model that same night. When his mother asked what happened, he only said, "It fell." That was the first lesson in composure. Not because he was weak, but because he knew even then that anger would not change the world. Dignity would. Now, sitting in first class on Aero Global Flight 762, that lesson echoed. His mother's voice seemed to whisper across the decades. Hold your head high. Do not let them decide who you are. Passengers whispered around him. Naomi Lee's phone continued streaming, her viewers multiplying by the minute. The slap had shocked them all, but Elijah's stillness unsettled them even more. It was as if he carried a secret that none of them could name. Elijah thought about his father, a mechanic who worked double shifts to keep food on the table. His father's hands were always calloused, always carrying the smell of oil and metal. Yet when Elijah asked him once why he worked so hard, his father smiled and said, "Because I want you to work with your mind, not just your hands. I want you to sit at tables they said you'd never reach." That dream had come true. Elijah had earned scholarships, studied economics at Howard, later an MBA at Stanford. He had spent years climbing through an industry where few faces looked like his. Every meeting, every negotiation, every boardroom required more proof, more effort, more restraint. He carried himself with calm precision because he knew one misstep could erase years of progress in a heartbeat. But behind the calm was fire. He had fought quietly, strategically, building an empire of competence. By 45, he was named CEO of Aero Global Airlines, a title that made headlines for its rarity and its symbolism. Some praised it as a milestone for representation. Others whispered he was a diversity hire. Elijah ignored both. What mattered was the work, the numbers, the safety of millions of passengers, the livelihoods of thousands of employees. And yet, here he was, slapped across the face in the cabin of his own airline by one of his own employees. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the laughter caught in his throat. The pain was not the sting of her hand, but the reminder that to her, he was not a CEO, not a leader, not even a valued customer. He was simply a black man in a place she thought he did not belong. The plane trembled slightly as it cut through a pocket of turbulence. Elijah's mind steadied on that vibration, almost grateful for the distraction. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, remembering a Navy deployment he had once led in his 20s. He had been in charge of logistics, moving supplies through dangerous waters. The stakes were high, the risks constant. He had learned to trust discipline, to remain calm even as others panicked. That training carried him now. "Are you okay, sir?" The voice belonged to Henry Collins, the retired teacher seated behind him. Henry leaned forward, his voice low but steady. His eyes were kind, filled with decades of recognition. Elijah gave a small nod. "I'm fine." But Henry shook his head. "No, you're not. And you shouldn't have to be. But I see what you're doing. I've seen it all my life. Holding it in, carrying the weight, hoping the world will notice without you having to shout. It's a heavy burden, son." Elijah's lips pressed together. He appreciated the words, but couldn't let himself unravel. "Not here. Not now." Naomi glanced over, her phone still raised. She whispered, "People are watching this all over the internet. They see you. They see what happened." Elijah opened his eyes and looked at her. She was young, maybe 25, but her determination reminded him of himself at that age. Brave, outspoken, unwilling to let injustice slide. He wondered what it meant that his dignity now depended not just on his silence, but on her voice and the voices of others who witnessed the truth. David Morales, the attorney, scribbled furiously on his pad, his eyes occasionally darting up to Elijah. He had recognized the boarding pass, the name printed in bold letters. He suspected who Elijah was, but didn't want to speak it aloud yet. Not until the time was right. The flight attendant, Melissa Carter, stood at the galley, arms crossed, her breathing uneven. Some passengers avoided looking at her. Others stared openly. She avoided Elijah's gaze completely. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked to Naomi's camera, then back down. She must have realized this was no longer just a personal spat. This was evidence, live, permanent. Elijah thought of his wife, Grace, back home in Chicago. She was a pediatrician, steady and nurturing, the anchor of his life. He thought of his 2 children, Maya and Jordan, grown now but still calling him for advice. What would they think when they saw this video? Would they feel rage, shame, or would they feel pride that he had not lowered himself to retaliation? His chest tightened with the weight of those questions. The inner struggle roared. Every instinct in his body screamed to stand, to demand justice, to shout down the insult. Yet another voice, older, deeper, reminded him that dignity was his shield, that sometimes the most powerful response was restraint. The minutes ticked by slowly. Passengers whispered to one another, some glaring at Melissa, others whispering about Elijah's calmness. Naomi's live stream comments flooded. "He's so composed. How is he not shouting? Who is this guy?" Elijah's mind drifted once more to his mother's lessons. She used to say, "The world will test you. Eli, the question isn't whether they'll disrespect you. The question is how you'll respond when they do." Here was the test, at 30,000 feet, with cameras rolling, with witnesses on every side. He lifted his notebook from his lap and opened it. Inside were pages filled with notes, plans, sketches of reform programs he had been developing for months. He had been preparing a new passenger dignity initiative, a system designed to monitor and improve customer experiences across the airline. He had hoped to announce it next quarter. Now, staring at the ink on the page, he realized life had forced his hand sooner than expected. He tapped the pen against the paper. One thought repeated in his mind. This isn't just a slap. This is a chance to prove that leadership is not about the titles on your business card. It is about how you respond when your very dignity is attacked. Elijah closed the notebook. He sat taller in his seat. The sting on his cheek had faded, but the fire in his spirit burned stronger than ever. No one in that cabin knew his full story yet. No one knew the decades of battles fought quietly, the resilience forged in silence, the victories earned against odds. But soon, they would. The cabin of Aero Global Flight 762 buzzed with the normal sounds of air travel. Pages of magazines flipped, soda cans cracked open. The quiet drone of conversations blended with the hum of the engines. From the outside, it looked like any other morning flight crossing the country. Yet for those seated in the first-class cabin, the air carried an unshakable tension. Elijah Grant adjusted his seat slightly, pressing the button to recline just a few degrees. His cheek no longer stung, but the memory of Melissa Carter's slap lingered. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt again the sudden sharpness, the disbelief, the silence that followed. He inhaled deeply and released the breath slowly. He would not let that single act define him. But he could feel the shift in the cabin. Passengers were no longer absorbed in their own worlds. They watched him, watched Melissa, watched each other. Some tried to look away when he met their eyes, embarrassed to have witnessed injustice and done nothing. Others held his gaze with sympathy, as if to say, "We saw. We know." Naomi Lee still had her phone raised, though she kept it angled low to avoid drawing too much attention. She whispered occasionally for her growing online audience. "We're cruising over the Midwest now. Things have calmed on the surface, but the tension is everywhere. You could cut it with a knife." She paused, then added softly, "I've never seen someone hold themselves like this man does. He hasn't raised his voice once, and yet he commands the whole cabin." Elias shifted his attention toward the window. The view below was endless sky, the faint curve of the earth visible at the horizon. He had always loved flying, not just because he ran an airline, but because of what the view represented. Above the clouds, everyone was the same. No one could see skin color, clothing, or bank accounts. Up here, humanity was simply humanity. But down in this cabin, that truth was harder to grasp. Melissa moved stiffly through the galley. She avoided eye contact with Elijah, but shot nervous glances toward Naomi's phone. Her jaw was tight, her movements jerky, as if the act of serving passengers now carried the weight of possible punishment. She poured a glass of champagne for the man in 2B, a businessman in a gray suit, then turned quickly away before she had to walk past Elijah again. Henry Collins watched closely from row 3. His old eyes narrowed, his mind turning over what he had seen. He had lived long enough to recognize the patterns. Disrespect began small. A different tone of voice, a lesser service, a question about whether you belonged where you were. Henry shook his head. The decades had passed. Presidents had come and gone. Laws had been written. Yet here it was, again, at 30,000 feet. David Morales set down his pen for a moment. He had been writing nearly nonstop since the incident, cataloging every detail with the precision of a lawyer building a case. He leaned slightly forward, speaking just loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Sir, I saw everything. If you decide to pursue this legally, you'll have no shortage of witnesses." Elijah's eyes flicked to him. For a brief moment, the calm mask slipped, revealing the weight of the decision pressing on him. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned back toward the window. Inwardly, he debated with himself. What did justice mean in this moment? Was it punishment for Melissa alone, or was it something larger, something systemic, something that demanded more than a single arrest? His mind traced the questions again and again, each time arriving at the same conclusion. The choice he made here would ripple far beyond this cabin. Naomi's live stream comments scrolled across her phone. Some viewers begged for Melissa to be arrested immediately. Others speculated about Elijah's identity. A few questioned whether the situation was being exaggerated, but most comments carried a single-thread awe at Elijah's composure. Elijah closed his notebook and folded his hands in his lap. He thought of the countless passengers who had flown Aeroglobal before him, people who didn't have cameras, people who weren't CEOs, people who faced slights and mistreatment with no witnesses to validate their pain. How many stories like this had been buried? How many times had silence been mistaken for consent? The engines roared slightly louder as the aircraft pushed through a headwind. The turbulence jolted the cabin, and glasses rattled on tray tables. For a moment, everyone clutched armrests, distracted by the sudden drop. Elijah almost welcomed it. Physical turbulence was easier than the emotional turbulence already raging. When the plane steadied, a young boy from row 5 walked forward, holding his mother's hand. He stopped near Elijah's seat, eyes wide. "Mom, that's the man, isn't it?" he whispered too loudly. The mother hushed him quickly, pulling him back, embarrassed. Elijah offered the boy a small smile, reassuring rather than dismissive. Children saw things clearly. They named truth without hesitation. Melissa's face reddened as she overheard. She busied herself with refilling a coffee pot, as if ignoring the moment would erase it. Henry Collins leaned forward again. "Son, you carry yourself like a man who knows storms. Don't let this one break you. They're watching. All of them." Elijah nodded faintly. His voice, when it came, was soft but firm. "I've weathered storms before." Those words hung in the air. Some passengers heard them and straightened in their seats. It was not a boast. It was a quiet reminder that dignity under pressure was a form of strength few could match. Naomi looked into her camera, whispering to her audience. "He just said he's weathered storms before. And I believe him. Whoever he is, this isn't his first battle, but it might be his most public." The minutes stretched long. The cabin crew carried on with mechanical gestures, but everyone knew normalcy had cracked wide open. What should have been a peaceful 3-hour flight was becoming something else, something historic. Elijah folded his hands tighter, his inner voice steadying him. He thought of Grace again, of Maya and Jordan. He imagined them watching this feed, their faces flashing through his mind. He wanted them to see not weakness, not anger, but an example of restraint, of composure, of the power to choose dignity even when dignity was denied. Melissa finally moved down the aisle again. Her eyes flickered toward Elijah, but darted away. The tray she carried trembled slightly in her hands. Passengers leaned back, some watching closely, others pretending to read. Elijah kept his gaze steady out the window. He would not give her the satisfaction of reaction. The ordinary flight was gone. In its place was a story unfolding second by second, one that would not remain sealed inside this aircraft. Cameras were rolling, witnesses were watching, and Elijah Grant was silently deciding how to transform pain into power. Somewhere below them, Chicago waited. The runway, the airport, the press, the inevitable confrontation. Elijah knew the moment the wheels touched ground. This incident would explode beyond the cabin walls. But for now, at 30,000 feet, the stage was set. A slap had broken the illusion of ordinary. What happened next would decide whether it remained just another ugly moment or became the spark that changed everything. Elijah sat taller, his mind clear despite the storm. He whispered a single sentence under his breath, not meant for anyone but himself. "This is bigger than me." Naomi's camera caught it. Her audience erupted with messages. Henry Collins closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. David Morales turned another page in his notes. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and the world was about to know it. The cabin had quieted, but the silence was not peace. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for the next spark. Elijah Grant kept his eyes on the window, the vast expanse of blue sky stretching endlessly. His reflection in the glass looked calm, composed, but inside, every thought weighed heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes on him, the sympathy from some, the unease from others, the quiet shame of those who wished they had spoken up sooner. Melissa Carter moved stiffly through the aisle again. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. She avoided looking at Elijah, but her unease was clear. Every movement carried the tension of someone who knew she had crossed a line, yet wasn't ready to admit it. She poured another drink for a passenger in row 1, her hands trembling just enough for the liquid to slosh against the rim. Naomi Lee lowered her phone for a moment, giving her arms a rest. Her live stream had already doubled, then tripled in viewers. Thousands of comments poured in from people around the world. They didn't know Elijah's name yet, but they knew injustice when they saw it. Naomi scrolled quickly, whispering, "They're saying this video has hit trending. This isn't just us anymore. The whole internet is watching." Elijah heard her words, but didn't react. He couldn't. Reacting meant revealing, and revealing meant losing the only advantage he had left control of when and how his truth came out. Henry Collins leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was low, but steady. "I've seen a lot of things in my life, but I've also seen how fast people forget if the right steps aren't taken. What you do next matters, son. It'll matter for all of us." Elijah nodded slightly, acknowledging the wisdom. He had always admired elders who carried their stories like maps. Henry's words pressed heavier than Melissa's slap ever could. David Morales cleared his throat softly. "Sir, forgive me, but I need to say something. I recognized your name on the boarding pass. I know who you are." He glanced around to make sure Melissa wasn't near, then leaned forward. "You're Elijah Grant, CEO of this airline, aren't you?" Elijah turned his head slowly, meeting the lawyer's gaze. His eyes revealed nothing at first, but after a pause, he gave the faintest nod. David inhaled sharply. "Then this changes everything." Naomi's ears caught the whisper, though her live stream did not. Her eyes widened. She mouthed silently. CEO Elijah offered her no confirmation, no denial. He simply pressed his lips together and looked forward again. The weight of the revelation hung heavy between them. If the world knew, the story would explode in ways no one could yet imagine. Melissa returned, her voice sharp as she addressed Elijah again. "Sir, I've had complaints about your attitude. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have to notify the captain." Gas rippled quietly through first class. The man had barely spoken. Her words twisted reality, painting him as the aggressor. Elijah exhaled slowly, steadying himself. His voice, when it came, was calm. "I've made no disruption. I've simply asked to be treated with the same dignity as others." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "That's your opinion." Passengers shifted, uneasy. A few muttered to themselves. One woman whispered loudly enough for Naomi's phone to catch. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Another nodded in agreement. Naomi, emboldened, lifted her phone higher. She spoke directly to her viewers. "You're all hearing this? Right. He's calm, composed, and she's making it sound like he's a problem. This is how gaslighting works. This is how injustice hides in plain sight." Melissa stiffened, realizing she was being recorded again. "Ma'am, stop filming," she snapped at Naomi. Naomi's voice didn't waver. "No, the world deserves to see this." The cabin froze. For the first time, Melissa realized she was not just confronting a passenger, but an audience of thousands, soon to be millions. Her control of the narrative was slipping away. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. His inner dialogue was relentless. He wanted to stand. He wanted to declare his identity, to remind her and everyone else exactly who he was. But he also knew timing was everything. A premature reveal would make the story about shock value instead of truth. He needed the right moment, the right words, the right stage. The engines droned louder, the plane shifting slightly as it began preparing for descent. Chicago was still an hour away, but the captain had announced earlier that weather on the ground might cause a turbulent approach. Elijah focused on that thought, grounding himself in something physical. Henry Collins spoke again, his voice firm now. "Enough is enough. Young man, you've held yourself with more grace than I've seen in a long time. But she's not going to stop. Someone has to step in." Henry pressed the call button. A chime rang. A different flight attendant, younger and clearly nervous, hurried forward. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" Henry's voice carried weight. "I need to report that a crew member has assaulted this passenger." He gestured toward Elijah. "We all saw it. It happened right here." The younger attendant's eyes widened. She looked at Elijah, then at Melissa, then back again. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She turned quickly toward the galley. Melissa's face flushed with anger. "That's a serious accusation," she hissed. "You'll regret this." Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady as stone. "No one regrets the truth." Naomi's phone trembled slightly in her hands. She whispered to her stream. "You just heard that. This isn't hidden anymore. It's official now. They'll have to act when we land." The tension grew unbearable. Passengers whispered more openly now. Some defended Elijah. A few tried to play neutral, shrinking into their seats. But the tide had shifted. Silence had broken. Elijah leaned back, closing his eyes once more. His thoughts were a storm. Should he reveal himself now, take control of the narrative before landing, or should he let the ground crew, the cameras, the press handle it? He imagined the headlines. He imagined the board of directors watching. He imagined his children scrolling through their feeds, seeing their father's face with words like slapped, assaulted, humiliated plastered across the screen. The inner conflict tore at him. Yet through it all, one truth held firm. This was bigger than him. David Morales whispered again. "When this plane lands, there will be law enforcement, media. This will not stay quiet. You have a chance to turn this into something more than a scandal. You can make it a turning point." Elijah opened his eyes, his calm restored. "That's exactly what I intend to do." Naomi's phone caught the words. Her viewers erupted. The comments flashed faster than she could read. The ordinary flight was long gone. The tension had risen to a breaking point. Every passenger knew something historic was unfolding around them. And Elijah Grant, calm and composed, was silently preparing for the moment when his truth would reshape everything. The engines hummed with steady rhythm, but the air inside the cabin had become jogged, every breath sharp with tension. People no longer pretended to read their magazines or scroll their phones. Every passenger in first class leaned slightly forward, caught in the invisible gravity pulling them toward Elijah Grant and the woman who had struck him. Melissa Carter's voice cut through the air once more. "Sir, I'm warning you. If you continue to create hostility in this cabin, I'll have no choice but to escalate." Her words dropped like stones, clashing against the reality everyone had just witnessed. Elijah sat tall, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his expression composed but unyielding. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't so much as moved toward her since the slap. Yet she spoke as if he were the threat. Henry Collins shook his head, his voice carrying across the rows. "This is backwards. That man hasn't done a single thing to anyone here. We all saw what happened. We all know the truth." Several passengers murmured their agreement. One woman in the aisle seat spoke louder, her frustration clear. "Stop pretending he's the problem. We saw you hit him. We saw it with our own eyes." Melissa's face flushed crimson, a mix of fear and defiance. She shot back. "I was maintaining order. His behavior was suspicious." The word suspicious echoed painfully in the cabin. Elijah's jaw tightened, though he kept his composure. Suspicious. It was a word that had shadowed him all his life. In stores, in neighborhoods, in boardrooms, even after he had earned his title. Now, at 30,000 feet, it came again, wielded like a weapon meant to strip him of dignity. Naomi Lee's live stream captured it all. Her phone trembled slightly in her hand as she whispered, "She just called him suspicious. To thousands of us watching, it's clear what that really means. She sees him as someone who doesn't belong here, and we all know why." The comments section on her screen erupted in fury. Messages scrolled faster than she could read. "This is racism. Arrest her. Protect that man." David Morales leaned forward, his voice steady but forceful. "Melissa, I am an attorney, and what you are doing right now is compounding your liability. You've already assaulted him physically. Now you are attempting to fabricate a narrative that paints him as the aggressor. Every word you speak is being documented. Every action you take is evidence." Melissa froze, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She turned her eyes toward Naomi's phone and realized with horror that her every movement, her every misstep, was being broadcast in real time. Elijah remained still, but inside, a storm churned. His thoughts raced between restraint and release. Should he reveal his identity now? Should he tear through the veil of assumptions and force the truth into the open? Or should he wait, hold the line, and let the landing ground become the stage where justice would be undeniable? His mind drifted briefly to Grace, his wife. He could picture her expression if she saw the live stream. She would be furious, protective, but she would also be watching him carefully. She knew the balance he carried between dignity and defiance. She knew the danger of letting rage speak louder than reason. The boy from row 5, the one who had whispered earlier, tugged on his mother's sleeve again. His young voice carried across the silence. "Mom, why is she being so mean to him?" The mother shushed him, her cheeks flushed, but the child's words hung in the cabin like a verdict no one could ignore. Melissa's breath quickened. Her authority, once unquestioned, was unraveling in front of her. Passengers no longer feared her tone. They challenged it, quietly at first, then louder. Henry Collins stood, his back straight despite his age. "No more," he declared. His voice carried the weight of generations who had endured too much. "We won't sit silent while you treat this man like he doesn't belong. Not today, not on this flight." Passengers applauded softly, hesitant at first, then stronger. Naomi's stream caught it all. Viewers typed furiously, cheering from across the world. Melissa turned, her voice breaking. "Sit down, sir. I'll have security waiting at the gate." Henry did not move. You'll have the FBI waiting for you. Young lady, because what you did isn't discipline. It's assault. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Melissa's composure shattered. You don't understand. People like him. She stopped, catching herself too late. The words had spilled far enough. A gasp filled the cabin. Naomi's phone caught the unfinished sentence, and the world outside filled in the blanks. Elijah finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He rose from his seat. His height was commanding, his presence undeniable. He turned to face the cabin, not Melissa. His voice was low, steady, and every word carried clarity. I have stayed silent long enough. I've chosen restraint because I know the world is watching. But let me be clear. What happened here is not just about me. It's about every passenger who has ever been told, without words or with them, that they do not belong. It's about every person who has been called suspicious for existing in a space that others decided was not theirs. The cabin fell into silence, the kind of silence that vibrates with truth. Naomi's viewers flooded her comments with messages of support, shock, and praise. Elijah's voice softened. Dignity is not optional. Respect is not a privilege you hand out when you feel generous. It is a right, and it is a right that too many have been denied for too long. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Her authority was gone, stripped bare by the weight of his words and the evidence of her actions. David Morales stood as well, his legal pad in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all witnesses. We will testify to what happened here. There will be no burying this. Not this time. Henry Collins nodded firmly. Amen to that. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, unaware of the drama playing out in his cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Chicago shortly. Please remain seated and prepare for landing. Elijah sat down again. The storm inside him finally steadied. He had not revealed his title yet. That moment would come, and when it did, it would change everything. But for now, he had reclaimed the narrative. The breaking point had passed, and he had not broken. Naomi whispered to her camera, "You all heard that? This isn't just a passenger anymore. This is a leader. Whoever he is, he just changed everything with those words." As the plane tilted into its descent, passengers exchanged glances heavy with recognition. They had witnessed something unforgettable. A slap had started it. A storm of dignity had followed, and the landing would bring a reckoning none of them could escape. The plane rocked slightly as it cut through a patch of turbulence. Overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers gripped their armrests. But no one was thinking about the bumps in the air. Every mind in first class was fixed on what had just happened, on the words Elijah Grant had spoken, and on the undeniable shift in power within the cabin. Melissa Carter stood frozen, her hands clutching the edge of the service cart like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her authority had evaporated. She had tried to control the story, tried to twist reality, but the witnesses had broken their silence. The cabin was no longer hers to command. Naomi Lee lifted her phone higher, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. To everyone watching, she whispered to her audience, this has gone beyond one confrontation. What you're seeing is truth being told in real time by people who refuse to stay silent. Her comments section scrolled at lightning speed. Tens of thousands were tuned in now. Messages poured in from across the globe. We believe him. Justice must happen. We've been here too. The story was no longer contained within the walls of the aircraft. It was spilling out into living rooms, offices, and cafes everywhere. David Morales rose halfway from his seat, notebook still in hand. His voice carried authority, the cadence of a man used to speaking in courtrooms. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make something absolutely clear. I witnessed a passenger being assaulted by a member of the crew. I witnessed him being accused without cause. And I witnessed him respond with dignity every step of the way. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of strangers who suddenly felt connected. I will provide testimony. I will ensure that this does not get buried. My training, my profession, demands accountability, and I intend to deliver it. Several passengers nodded, some murmuring words of agreement. The collective fear that had kept them quiet was unraveling, thread by thread. Sophia Turner, a management consultant traveling on her way to a client meeting, raised her phone timidly. I recorded the whole thing, she said, her voice trembling but firm. From the moment she raised her hand to now, I didn't know if I should, but I did, and I'll share it with whoever needs it. Naomi turned her camera toward Sophia for a brief second. Did you hear that she asked her stream? We now have video proof from another passenger, not just me. Sophia's hand shook, but she didn't lower her phone. She added, I didn't want to stay silent. Too many times I've seen people stay silent. Henry Collins rose again, steady as an oak tree weathered by decades of storms. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen history repeat itself too many times. Let me tell you something, he said, his tone solemn. I've lived through eras when staying silent meant survival. But I've also lived long enough to know that silence only protects the wrong people. Today, I'm not staying silent. I saw that woman strike him. I saw her words try to strip him of his humanity. And I will speak that truth until my last breath. The cabin fell quiet, not because people disagreed, but because the gravity of Henry's words sank deep into them. A truth spoken from the lips of someone who had lived long enough to earn the right to speak it. Elijah sat still, his gaze lowered for a moment, absorbing the voices rising around him. A part of him wanted to thank them, to tell them their courage mattered. Another part of him, the quieter part, felt the pressure of what their voices meant. This was no longer about him alone. This was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or erased. Naomi's phone buzzed with notifications. She glanced at the screen and gasped. 100,000 people, she whispered, almost to herself. There are 100,000 people watching right now. Her eyes darted to Elijah. The world is hearing this. They're not just seeing injustice. They're seeing resistance. They're seeing dignity. Melissa finally broke her silence. Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control. You all don't understand. He was being difficult. Sophia cut her off, louder than she intended. Stop lying. We were here. We know the truth, David added. Every word you say digs you deeper. You need to stop. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned sharply, retreating into the galley like a soldier retreating from a battlefield she no longer controlled. Elijah exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly. For a brief moment, relief flickered across his face. He had not asked for their defense, but he welcomed it. He had carried dignity alone for so long. Now others carried it with him. Naomi looked into her lens again. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the power of the moment. Everyone watching, remember this. The only reason this story is being told is because witnesses refused to stay silent. Imagine how many times this has happened when no one spoke. when no one recorded, when no one believed the victim. Today is different because truth has voices. The comment stream erupted again. People shared their own stories of being profiled, mistreated, dismissed. The cabin of Flight 762 had become a mirror for thousands of lives across the world. Henry Collins sank back into his seat, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion of standing so firmly. Elijah turned toward him, his voice soft. "Thank you." Henry met his gaze with steady eyes. "Don't thank me. Just make it count." Those words lodged deep in Elijah's chest. Make it count. He thought of Grace, Maya, Jordan. He thought of the people he represented, not because he asked to, but because circumstance had placed him here. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and unaware. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent into Chicago shortly. Weather is clear, a little windy on the ground, but nothing to worry about. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts." The announcement felt almost absurd against the storm brewing in the cabin. The rest of the world still expected a routine landing. Only those inside knew they were descending into a maelstrom of cameras, agents, and questions. Elijah pressed his palms against his knees, grounding himself. His inner dialogue surged again. Should he reveal himself as CEO before the wheels touched down? Should he let the world discover it, through the chaos of cameras waiting at O'Hare? He wrestled with the decision. His dignity demanded silence, patience. His responsibility demanded action. Naomi glanced at him, her phone still steady. "Whoever you are," she whispered, "you're not just a passenger anymore. You're a symbol now." Elijah turned his gaze toward her, and for a fleeting moment, something passed between them, acknowledgement of a truth bigger than both of them. As the plane dipped lower, the witnesses' voices settled into a tense silence. They had spoken. The truth was out. Now the landing would decide what came next. The breaking point had passed. The voices had risen. The world was listening, and Elijah Grant was ready. The sky outside had shifted from endless blue to a pale haze, the faint outline of Chicago beginning to appear through the clouds. Seatbelt signs glowed overhead as the aircraft prepared for descent, but no one in first class was focused on the city below. All eyes remained fixed on Elijah Grant, the man who had endured humiliation and violence, yet carried himself with the calm of someone who knew storms could be weathered. Melissa Carter had retreated into the galley, her voice muffled in tense conversations with the other attendants. Every few minutes she peeked into the cabin, her expression flickering between anger and dread. She knew the ground below was no longer just an airport. It was a stage she couldn't control, and her every word, her every gesture, had already been documented. Naomi Lee's phone buzzed continuously as her stream swelled beyond anything she had imagined. Her eyes darted across the comments. Viewers were begging to know more about the man at the center of it all. Who was he? Why did he command such calm authority? Naomi glanced at Elijah, hesitation flickering in her mind. Should she say it? Should she reveal the whisper David Morales had shared earlier? David himself seemed restless. His notebook sat open on his lap, filled with meticulous notes of times, phrases, and witness statements. He leaned closer to Elijah. His voice was quiet, but urgent. "Sir, forgive me for pressing again, but the world deserves to know who you are. If they knew the truth before we land, this story would break wide open. It wouldn't just be about a man assaulted on a plane. It would be about power, accountability, hypocrisy at the highest level." Elijah's gaze stayed fixed on the clouds outside. His reflection stared back at him from the window steady. composed, unreadable. Inside, however, he wrestled with the decision. Should he hold the revelation until the ground, when cameras and microphones could capture it in full, or should he seize this moment, while the injustice still burned hot, while the witnesses' voices still carried weight in the cabin itself? Henry Collins, ever the elder statesman, seemed to sense Elijah's turmoil. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize pivotal moments. "Son, you've carried yourself with grace, but sometimes grace means letting people know the full truth. Don't hide what you are, not from her, not from us, not from the world." The words pressed hard against Elijah's chest. He thought of his father, who had worked factory shifts for 40 years without recognition, who had been called boy by supervisors half his age. He thought of his mother, who had taught him to walk tall no matter how heavy the burden. And he thought of Grace, Maya, and Jordan, his family, who deserved a husband and father, who didn't just survive injustice, but transformed it. The aircraft jolted slightly, another pocket of turbulence. Gas rose from the cabin, but Elijah remained still. He drew a breath, deep and grounding, then turned from the window to face the passengers around him. His voice was calm, deliberate, and every syllable carried weight. "My name," he began, "is Elijah Grant." A ripple passed through the cabin. Naomi's phone trembled in her hands as she adjusted quickly, ensuring every word was captured. "I am not just a passenger on this flight," Elijah continued. "I am the chief executive officer of Global Airlines, the very airline operating this plane." The cabin fell into stunned silence. For a moment, even the steady roar of the engines seemed to fade. Passengers exchanged shocked glances, their eyes wide, their posture shifting as the full gravity of the revelation landed. Naomi's viewers exploded in the comments. "He's the CEO, unbelievable," she slapped her own boss. The feed surged past 200,000 live viewers, a wave of disbelief and outrage sweeping across the digital world. David Morales sat back, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Well," he said softly, "there it is." Henry Collins closed his eyes briefly, murmuring under his breath, "About time." Sophia Turner gasped audibly, her hand covering her mouth. She hit the CEO. Oh my God." Melissa appeared in the aisle at that very moment, her face pale. She had overheard it, her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, the certainty in her eyes gave way to raw fear. Elijah met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, neither cruel nor forgiving, only steady. "Yes, Melissa," he said softly but firmly. "The man you struck, the man you called suspicious, is the one who signs your paychecks, the one responsible for the future of this airline." Her knees wobbled. She grabbed the side of the galley for balance. I didn't know." Elijah shook his head slowly. "That's the point. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with dignity." The words cut deeper than any punishment. Melissa lowered her eyes, shame flushing her cheeks. Naomi whispered into her stream, her voice shaking. "You heard it here. He is the CEO. This changes everything." The comment section erupted again. "This is history." She slapped the CEO of the airline she works for. "Accountability must happen now." Elijah sank back into his seat, his shoulders heavy with the weight of revelation. He hadn't wanted to reveal himself like this. He had wanted to wait for the ground, for the cameras and microphones. But Henry was right. This was the moment. And the truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. The other passengers shifted in their seats, processing what they had just heard. Some looked at Elijah with newfound respect, others with disbelief. But no one doubted any more that what they had witnessed was more than a personal altercation. It was systemic, symbolic, undeniable. Henry leaned closer. "Now the world will listen," he said quietly. Elijah nodded. "Now they must." The plane banked slightly, the city of Chicago sprawling below them. Skyscrapers glinted in the sunlight, highways twisted like veins, and Lake Michigan shimmered at the horizon. But the beauty of the view was lost on the cabin. Every mind was fixed on what awaited them when the wheels touched down. Naomi ended her segment with a whisper that carried urgency. "To everyone watching, stay tuned. We're about to land in Chicago. Law enforcement will be here. Media will be here. And now that you know who he is, this story is going to explode." Melissa remained in the galley, silent, her face pale. She knew her career was over. What she didn't know was how wide the consequences would spread, how deep the questions would go, or how much this moment would reshape the airline she worked for. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, centering himself for what was to come. His inner voice was steady now. The fear was gone. The decision had been made. When the wheels touched down, the story would no longer be confined to the cabin. It would belong to the world. The truth had been revealed. The descent had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The seatbelt chime rang out again, sharper this time, as the Boeing 737 began its gradual tilt toward Chicago O'Hare. Outside, the city glowed in the late afternoon sun, Lake Michigan shimmering like polished glass. For most flights, this was the moment when passengers quietly returned trays, checked phones for signal, and thought about the lives waiting for them below. But in the cabin of Flight 762, every thought was chained to what had just been revealed. Elijah Grant sat motionless, staring at the skyline piercing the clouds. His heart thudded with the rhythm of the engines, steady but heavy. Revealing his identity had been a gamble, but it was necessary. The truth couldn't wait. Now. The world knew. Now. There was no hiding. Naomi Lee clutched her phone, her knuckles pale from gripping too tightly. Her live stream viewer count had passed 250,000. Every word Elijah had spoken had already been clipped, replayed, and shared across platforms. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered into her mic, her voice trembling with anticipation, "we're minutes away from touchdown in Chicago. Law enforcement is waiting at the gate. The CEO of Aero Global Airlines, Elijah Grant, has just been revealed as the victim of this assault. The world is watching." Her comments surged like floodwaters. "Press charges now. History in the making. Melissa must be arrested. Elijah is a hero." Naomi swallowed hard. She hadn't expected her business trip to become a digital megaphone for justice. She was exhilarated, terrified, and profoundly aware that her lens was now a conduit for truth too big to silence. Melissa Carter stayed hidden in the galley, her back pressed against the service panel, her mind spinning faster than the engines outside. The CEO. She had struck the CEO. The memory replayed in her mind, a loop she couldn't escape. Her breath came shallow, her pulse racing. She wanted to defend herself, to insist it wasn't what it looked like, that she had been following procedure, but every excuse felt hollow now. She knew, deep in her bones, that her career was finished. Worse than that, her freedom might be in jeopardy. Assaulting a passenger was one thing. Assaulting the CEO, in front of hundreds of thousands of live viewers, was another entirely. Henry Collins adjusted his glasses, glancing around the cabin. His voice broke the heavy silence. "Everyone here," he said softly but firmly. Remember this moment. When we walk off this plane, reporters will shout, cameras will flash, and voices will compete. Don't let anyone twist what happened. Don't let them erase what we saw with our own eyes. David Morales nodded, tapping his pen against the notebook in his lap. I'll make sure of that. I'll give a formal statement to the FBI as soon as they board. This will hold in court, not just in the headlines. Sophia Turner, still shaken but resolute, added, I'll share my video too. They can't ignore us all. Elijah glanced at them, his expression softening. Thank you, he said simply. His words weren't grand, but they carried weight, gratitude anchored by dignity. The captain's voice broke in, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for landing at O'Hare. Weather on the ground is breezy but clear. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your belongings secured. We'll be on the ground in approximately 10 minutes. A murmur ran through the cabin. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until the door opened, until the chaos waiting outside would pour in. Naomi lowered her phone briefly, her eyes meeting Elijah's. Are you ready? She asked quietly. Elijah exhaled, steadying himself. I've been ready my whole life, he replied. The words struck Naomi with unexpected force. They weren't dramatic, but they carried the quiet truth of someone who had endured injustice too many times to count. Outside, the city grew larger, details sharpening as the aircraft descended. Cars traced ribbons of light along the highways. The river glistened, snaking through the grid of buildings. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was charged, every breath heavy with anticipation. Melissa peeked out from the galley, her eyes scanning the passengers who had turned against her. Their stares were heavy, condemning. She retreated again, her mind a whirl of panic. She thought of her supervisors, of her family, of the headlines that would paint her name in bold letters tomorrow morning. She thought of the word she had used, suspicious, and how it had betrayed everything she tried to hide. Elijah shifted slightly, pressing his palms flat against his thighs. His inner dialogue hummed again. He thought of the employees waiting back at headquarters in Dallas, the board scrambling to manage the storm. He imagined Richard Owens, the chairman, already drafting statements, already calculating the cost. But none of that mattered more than what would happen in these next minutes. The truth wasn't just corporate. It was human. Naomi whispered into her phone again. We're on final approach. For those just joining, you're watching a moment that will likely change aviation history. The man you see here, Elijah Grant, CEO of Aero Global Airlines, was struck by a flight attendant mid-air. He responded with dignity, and now law enforcement is waiting on the ground. The viewer count ticked upward, surging toward 300,000. Henry reached across the aisle, placing his hand briefly on Elijah's arm. Whatever happens down there, he said, his voice steady, don't let them strip you of what you've already won. You held your dignity. That's what people will remember. Elijah met his eyes and gave a small nod. The landing gear dropped with a thud, a mechanical groan reverberating through the floor. Passengers braced instinctively, the ground rushing closer. Through the windows, the runways of O'Hare stretched long and gray, dotted with blinking lights. Fire trucks and police cars were already visible, parked near the designated gate. Their lights flashed red and blue, urgent against the tarmac. Gas rose from the cabin. They're already here, someone whispered. Naomi swung her camera toward the window, giving her audience a glimpse of the flashing lights. Do you see that security and law enforcement are waiting? This is unprecedented. The aircraft touched down with a screech of tires, the engines roaring as it slowed. Passengers were pressed back into their seats, then swayed forward as the plane decelerated. A collective breath released, but the tension only grew. They were on the ground now, but the real storm was still ahead. Elijah sat straighter, his hands folded once more. He knew the door would open soon. He knew the FBI would step on board. The cameras would be inches from his face. The questions would fly faster than the wind outside. He felt no fear, only resolve. Melissa, pale and trembling, clutched the galley counter. She knew the knock on the cabin door wouldn't be for him. It would be for her. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Naomi gave her closing words for the stream. To everyone watching this is history unfolding. We're pulling into the gate now. Stay with me. The next moments will decide everything. The aircraft slowed, turning toward a jet bridge surrounded by flashing lights and uniformed officers. Reporters' cameras were already pointed through the terminal windows, trying to catch glimpses inside. For the passengers of Flight 762, the descent wasn't just into Chicago, it was into a reckoning. And for Elijah Grant, it was into the heart of a fight he had been preparing for his entire life. The tires of Flight 762 met the runway with a screech of rubber against asphalt, sending a vibration through the cabin that rattled trays and phones alike. Outside, the sprawling expanse of Chicago O'Hare's tarmac stretched endlessly under a pale gray sky, dotted with ground vehicles and law enforcement personnel preparing for what was about to unfold. Inside the cabin, every passenger's eyes were wide, every breath measured, as if they were all bracing for impact, not just from the landing, but from the storm waiting on the other side of the doors. Elijah Grant remained calm, almost eerily so. The hum of the engines and the vibration beneath his seat didn't shake him. He could feel the tension radiating from the other passengers, the anxious tremor in Naomi's fingers as she gripped her phone, the nervous energy of Henry and David as they prepared their statements. But Elijah's mind was focused. He knew that once the doors opened, the real test would begin not of his patience, but of the system itself. Melissa Carter sat frozen in the galley, her mind replaying the past hour in a dizzying loop. She had struck the CEO. She had humiliated him in front of hundreds of witnesses. And now law enforcement awaited her on the tarmac, ready to take action. Her chest tightened with panic. She imagined the news coverage, the inevitable social media storm, the calls from her supervisors, the potential termination, and maybe even criminal charges. The weight of her actions pressed on her from every angle. For the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. The captain's voice cut through the tension, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 762 has safely landed at O'Hare International. We request that all passengers remain seated with their seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats, some leaning toward windows to catch a glimpse of the tarmac activity, others exchanging whispered speculation about what would happen next. Naomi's live stream continued, capturing every detail, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of excitement and anxiety around her. We are on the ground. The aircraft has touched down safely. Law enforcement is in position at Gate 12. This is unprecedented. The CEO of Aero Global Airlines, Elijah Grant, is about to step off the plane after being assaulted mid-flight. Elijah exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of thousands of eyes on him, both in the cabin and online. He straightened his jacket, subtly adjusted his tie, and prepared himself to leave the safety of the plane. His mind ran through scenarios, anticipating the possible reactions of law enforcement, the media, and the public. He felt a quiet determination settle over him. He had to remain composed, measured, in control, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had witnessed the incident, for Naomi's audience, for the integrity of his company, and for the larger principle at stake. Henry Collins leaned closer. "You've got this," he said quietly. "Remember, the moment you step off this plane, the narrative is yours. Own it." Elijah gave a slight nod, appreciating the encouragement, but feeling the familiar pull of inner conflict. He wondered about the balance between personal dignity and public spectacle. Could justice be served without turning into a circus? Could he remain human in the midst of institutional machinery? These thoughts weighed on him, but he didn't let them show. The aircraft slowed further, taxiing toward Gate 12. Melissa could see the approaching figures of police officers, their presence both intimidating and inevitable. Panic gripped her, and she realized there was no escape, no hiding from the consequences of her actions. She thought about how her life would change in the coming hours, the conversations she would have to face, the apologies she might never be able to deliver convincingly. The plane came to a complete stop. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers unfastened their belts, some standing, others remaining seated in anticipation. Naomi whispered into her phone, keeping the live stream rolling. "We're moments away. The doors are about to open. The world is watching." Elias stood, his movements calm and deliberate. He checked his reflection in the small window of the galley door, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the exit. His every step was measured, almost ceremonial, as if the act of leaving the plane was itself a statement of poise and defiance. Melissa stepped out slightly, frozen, and stared at him. Her expression was a mix of fear, disbelief, and guilt. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to want to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came. She was paralyzed by the magnitude of the situation. The cabin door opened, and a rush of cool Chicago air swept in. Officers positioned themselves strategically on the jet bridge, their eyes scanning every passenger. Cameras from news crews and Naomi's live stream captured the unfolding scene, framing every gesture, every expression. Elijah's first step onto the jet bridge felt like stepping into a different dimension, one where reality and symbolism intertwined. He could see the line of law enforcement waiting, poised to intervene, but also ready to follow his lead in controlling the situation. Every eye in the world that had tuned into Naomi's stream was watching him now. Melissa Carter was brought forward by two officers, her movements hesitant. She avoided Elijah's gaze, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. She understood that the moment she faced him directly would be defining, not just for her, but for the story being told to the public. Elijah paused, briefly scanning the faces around him, the other passengers, Naomi, Henry. David then focused on Melissa. His expression was calm but resolute, not an ounce of anger in his features. It was dignity incarnate, the quiet power of someone who had endured but refused to break. "Melissa Carter," he said clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly over the ambient noise of the tarmac. "You have the right to explain, but you do not have the right to justify what you did. The consequences are yours to face, and you will answer for them." Melissa swallowed hard, her lips parting but no sound emerging. Her mind raced through defenses, but they all seemed futile. She was aware that this confrontation was no longer private. The entire world had become the jury. Officers stepped forward, gently guiding her toward a waiting vehicle, ensuring that she could not escape or cause further harm. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, replaced by the stark realization that accountability was unavoidable. Elijah took another step, signaling the end of the immediate confrontation. He felt a surge of quiet triumph, not in vengeance, but in the affirmation that dignity and truth had not been crushed. The passengers began to exhale collectively, some whispering words of gratitude, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had witnessed. Naomi continued her live stream, her voice trembling but steady. History has been made today. Justice has been asserted without violence. The CEO of Global Airlines has stood firm against aggression. Melissa Carter is now in custody, and the public will see that accountability is not optional. Elijah felt the pull of the crowd's eyes, of the cameras, of the intangible force of millions watching in real time. He knew the path ahead would be long press statements, internal investigations, legal proceedings, but he had won the first and most important battle. He had preserved the narrative of truth, of courage, and of quiet strength. The crowd of law enforcement, media, and passengers slowly parted, allowing Elijah to continue down the jet bridge. His mind briefly wandered to the employees back at Global headquarters, the people who depended on him not just for leadership, but for integrity. He imagined the ripple effect of today's events, the conversations that would be sparked, the policies that would be reconsidered, the culture that might finally begin to shift. Finally, he reached the terminal, stepping fully into the fluorescent-lit hallways of O'Hare. Cameras flashed, microphones reached toward him, and the murmurs of passengers filled the air. Yet Elijah remained composed. Every word, every gesture, every pause was deliberate, a masterclass in restraint and presence. He glanced back once at the aircraft, the scene of confrontation now behind him, the memory of tension, of injustice, of courage under pressure, lingered. But he knew that what mattered now was the work ahead, the stories to be told accurately, the systems to be corrected, the lives to be impacted positively. Naomi whispered softly into her phone as she wrapped up the live stream. This is Elijah Grant, and today we witness the power of dignity, accountability, and truth. Flight 762 will be remembered not for conflict alone, but for the courage of one man who refused to be diminished. Elijah exhaled, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. The fight was not over, but the first victory had been claimed. He walked toward the waiting car, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, yet tempered by the quiet satisfaction of having faced injustice with integrity. Melissa swallowed, her throat dry, her mind scrambling for an explanation, any excuse that could soften the reality she now faced. Her eyes darted nervously to the officers flanking her, to the journalists and cameras capturing every detail. She knew that the world was watching, that this moment would be dissected, replayed, and analyzed in ways she could not even imagine. She felt exposed, stripped of the authority she had clung to, and for the first time, she questioned her own choices. Elijah's gaze remained steady. There was no trace of malice, only the calm clarity of someone who had endured an injustice, yet refused to mirror it with hatred. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without shouting, demanding accountability without theatrics. The passengers who had witnessed the incident mid-flight now stared from their seats, some holding their phones, some quietly shaking their heads, all absorbing the weight of what was unfolding. "Ms. Carter," Elijah continued, his tone measured, almost pedagogical, "you assaulted a passenger in a position of complete trust. This is not merely a personal affront. It is a breach of ethical duty. It is a violation of the principles that are supposed to protect every individual on this aircraft, and by extension, in our society. Melissa opened her mouth, tried to speak, but the words came out as a stammered jumble. I didn't. I mean, I thought... You thought you could act without consequence, Elijah interjected softly, yet with unmistakable authority. You thought a uniform or title absolved you of responsibility, that your power gave you immunity from the repercussions of harming another human being. His words hung in the air, heavy and precise. Melissa's face flushed, the weight of shame pressing down on her. She realized that no corporate hierarchy, no polite deflection, no feigned ignorance would rescue her now. Every action had consequences, and this moment was proof. Meanwhile, Naomi kept her camera steady, narrating softly but urgently into her live stream. Elijah Grant, the CEO of Aero Global Airlines, is confronting the flight attendant who assaulted him mid-air. Passengers are watching, officers are in position, and the story is about to unfold on a scale never seen before. Henry Collins stepped closer to Elijah, offering subtle support. "Do you want me to step in?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the tension between Melissa and the CEO. Elijah shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. "No, this is the moment for clarity, not intervention. Let her face the truth herself." The officers guided Melissa forward, ensuring that every movement was controlled, yet dignified. She tried to keep her composure, but the magnitude of the situation gnawed at her. She had been trained to handle crises, to manage people, to command respect, but nothing had prepared her for this personal reckoning broadcasted live to the world. As they reached a designated area near the jet bridge, a small group of airline executives and legal representatives arrived, moving quickly to contain the unfolding spectacle. Their presence was reassuring to some, a reminder of protocol and procedure, yet it did little to alleviate the raw human emotions at play. Elijah turned his attention to the executives, his voice calm but firm. "I expect full cooperation. This is not just about this flight, this incident, or this individual. It is about systemic accountability, about setting a precedent that protects every passenger, every employee, and every principle our company claims to uphold." The executives nodded, some scribbling notes, others whispering urgently among themselves. The tension was palpable, the kind that lingered in the air like a storm before it breaks. Melissa Carter, meanwhile, felt a pang of panic. She realized the gravity of what she had done, not just personally, but institutionally. Her mind raced through the potential fallout, legal consequences, career derailment, public shame. Her heart thudded in her chest as she struggled to reconcile the arrogance that had driven her actions with the stark reality confronting her now. "Ms. Carter," Alicia said, breaking through her thoughts. "You have the right to explanation, but explanations do not negate actions. You will cooperate fully with the investigation, and you will take responsibility. This is not a negotiation. This is accountability." Melissa's hands trembled as she adjusted the cuffs the officers had secured. She felt the weight of Elijah's eyes, not as a threat, but as a mirror reflecting the true extent of her misjudgment. The quiet intensity of his presence was more intimidating than any raised voice or threatening gesture could have been. Passengers continued to observe, many whispering among themselves. Naomi's live stream audience exploded with comments, questions, and reactions. Some viewers expressed outrage at Melissa's behavior, others admiration for Elijah's poise. Across social media, the story began to trend instantly, the incident sparking debates about corporate power, racial bias, and accountability in public service roles. Henry and David exchanged glances. "He's handling this better than anyone could have expected," David whispered. "It's like he's teaching a lesson in dignity under pressure." Elijah finally released Melissa with a controlled gesture, signaling the officers to escort her to a secure area for further questioning and potential suspension. She walked slowly, head down, feeling the enormity of the situation crash around her. The cameras, the passengers, the executives, the law enforcement, all of them bore witness. As Melissa was taken away, Elijah turned to address the passengers. His voice was calm, steady, and resonant. "To everyone here today, and to those watching beyond these walls, let this be a moment of reflection. The power we hold, whether through position, authority, or social status, must be exercised responsibly. Actions have consequences, and accountability is not optional." A few passengers clapped quietly. Some nodded solemnly. Others wiped away tears. Naomi lowered her camera briefly, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. She had witnessed history unfold, not through spectacle, but through the quiet power of composure, dignity, and moral clarity. The airport began to move in controlled chaos. Officers coordinated with airline staff, securing the aircraft, processing statements from witnesses, and preparing to document the incident fully. The press swarmed outside, their cameras catching glimpses of the drama as it transitioned from inside the aircraft to the tarmac and beyond. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of tension begin to ease, replaced by a quiet determination. There was more work to do, more steps to take to ensure that justice and accountability were maintained. But this moment, the confrontation, the public recognition of wrongdoing, the assertion of ethical authority was pivotal. Naomi whispered to him as they walked away from the immediate scene. "You handled that perfectly, calm, measured, and human. People are going to remember this, not just the conflict, but the way you carried yourself through it." Elijah allowed himself a brief smile, inwardly acknowledging the tension that had dominated the past hours, but refusing to let it control him. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's about setting the standard, about showing that no one is above responsibility, no matter who they are or what title they hold." And as the passengers slowly disembarked, some still shaken, some quietly reflective, the lesson of Flight 762 settled into the collective consciousness: dignity under pressure, accountability in action, and the undeniable truth that true leadership is measured not by authority wielded, but by integrity maintained when it matters most. Passengers whispered among themselves, some reaching for their phones to continue documenting, others simply processing the intensity of the events they had witnessed. The live stream continued to hum with activity, comments flooding in from around the globe. Social media exploded, news outlets scrambled to confirm details, and the narrative of Flight 762 began to take shape as a story of courage, accountability, and the quiet power of ethical leadership. And in the midst of it all, Elijah Grant remained a figure of calm authority, the anchor in a storm of chaos, a reminder that true power does not need to shout to be heard. By the time Elijah stepped off the aircraft, the media frenzy was already in full swing. Helicopters hovered in the distance, reporters jostled for position, and social media feeds lit up with fragments of the incident. He moved with quiet authority, his expression calm yet unyielding, each step deliberate, as if reminding himself that every action mattered in the unfolding narrative. As the press cameras swiveled to capture him, Elijah allowed himself a deep, controlled breath. The reality of what had happened, the assault, the confrontation, the viral exposure was settling into his consciousness. He had survived the ordeal not just by asserting authority, but by holding on to patience and moral clarity. by refusing to let rage or humiliation dictate his actions. This moment, he knew, was bigger than himself. It was a reflection of systemic issues, of inequities embedded in structures that so many accepted without question. Meanwhile, Melissa Carter sat in a sterile room inside the airport security area, her hands folded stiffly in her lap. The initial shock had given way to a gnawing sense of dread. She replayed the mid-air confrontation over and over in her mind. Her internal dialogue, a chaotic storm of excuses, regrets, and fear. She wondered how a single moment of hubris could unravel years of training, effort, and career ambition. The officers gave her space, but their presence was a constant reminder that every choice had consequences. Outside, the passengers were being debriefed by the airline, officers taking statements, collecting boarding passes, and asking for recollections of the events as they unfolded. Some passengers approached Elijah, expressing gratitude and admiration, their words tinged with relief and awe. Others remained silent, processing the gravity of what they had witnessed. Each interaction was a small but significant acknowledgement of the human dignity that had been defended mid-flight. Naomi continued to live stream. Her camera focused carefully as she interviewed witnesses, capturing nuanced reactions. One elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, whispered, "I've never seen anyone handle injustice like that." He didn't yell. He didn't lose control. He just stood in truth. Naomi nodded, her own voice subdued, recognizing the rare composure Elijah had exhibited in a setting most would consider volatile beyond measure. Elijah retreated briefly to a quiet corner near the airport lounge. He removed his jacket, loosening the tension in his shoulders, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. This was the first time since boarding that he could confront his own emotions without the immediate pressure of performing leadership. He thought about the passengers, the crew, and the countless individuals who might encounter similar situations in the future. The responsibility weighed heavily, but not oppressively. It was a mantle he bore with intention, understanding that change often began with steadfast moral choices in moments that demanded courage. Meanwhile, Melissa Carter faced a different kind of reckoning. Alone with her thoughts, she grappled with her sense of identity and authority. Every justification she had rehearsed felt hollow now. She remembered the subtle cues of doubt in her colleagues' eyes, the silent judgment from passengers, the unflinching calm of the man she had assaulted. She realized that power without empathy was fragile, and authority without accountability was destructive. The recognition was uncomfortable, painful even, but it was the only pathway to understanding the depth of her mistakes. Back in the terminal, Elijah was approached by an airline investigator, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Grant, we need a formal statement. The incident will be thoroughly documented, and the airline is preparing internal and public communications. We want to ensure accuracy and transparency." Elijah nodded. "I will provide what is needed. But the key here is clarity. The facts are simple. A passenger was assaulted, procedures were violated, and accountability must be enforced. Everything else is commentary." The investigator scribbled notes furiously, his eyes occasionally meeting Elijah's, clearly aware that this was more than just a routine report. This was a historic moment, a case study in ethics, leadership, and the consequences of systemic failure. Melissa's reflection continued, more intense with each passing minute. She remembered the microaggressions she had dismissed, the patterns of behavior she had normalized, the bias she had unconsciously upheld. She realized that the incident was not solely her failure, but also a reflection of institutional complacency. This recognition did not absolve her, but it forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided, that complicity in systemic injustice was as destructive as overt aggression. Elijah, sensing the growing tension in the terminal, decided to speak briefly with the gathered media. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying weight without arrogance. What occurred today was unacceptable, not because of one individual's actions alone, but because it reflects larger issues we must address. Accountability, transparency, and human dignity are non-negotiable. This is not a moment to assign blame alone, but to commit to lasting change in the way we treat one another, both in the air and on the ground. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled notes, and social media notifications surged. Elijah's message resonated, not as rhetoric, but as an authentic call to action, one anchored in his lived experience and the gravity of what had transpired. Melissa, escorted to meet with airline leadership, felt a hollow knot in her stomach. The executives were professional, controlled, yet she could sense the unspoken judgment behind their eyes. She had no way to soften the impact of her actions. Each word she prepared to speak felt insufficient. She wondered how she would navigate the legal, professional, and personal consequences that loomed over her. In a quiet hallway, Elijah paused, observing the flurry of activity with measured detachment. He thought about the passengers who had silently borne witness, about the young crew members who would carry lessons learned from today into their future interactions. He reflected on the subtle power of composure, the unspoken authority of moral clarity, and the way courage manifested not in aggression, but in the steadfast commitment to principles even when challenged. As the airport's activity continued, Elijah allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the calmness he had managed to maintain, for the courage of those who spoke out, for the clarity of purpose that had guided him through a harrowing ordeal. He knew the incident would echo far beyond the terminal, beyond the flight, into conversations, policies, and systemic change. Melissa's reckoning, in contrast, was internal yet equally profound. She understood now that reputation, authority, and control meant little without ethical grounding. The memory of Elijah's calm resolve haunted her, a constant reminder that integrity could not be faked, that actions had consequences regardless of intent or social hierarchy. By evening, media coverage had intensified, social platforms buzzing with debates about corporate responsibility, racial bias, and the power dynamics inherent in the airline industry. Passengers shared first-hand accounts, each narrative reinforcing the impact of Elijah's measured response and the profound implications of Melissa's misjudgment. The incident became more than a viral moment. It evolved into a public reckoning, a lens through which society examined accountability, privilege, and moral courage at a nearby quiet lounge. Elijah sat with Henry and David, reflecting on the day's events. Moments like these define more than careers or reputations, Elijah said softly. They define character. They test patience, empathy, and resilience. It's not enough to endure. One must respond with clarity and purpose. Henry nodded. You've set a precedent that people will remember, not just for confronting wrongdoing, but for how you handled it with dignity and restraint. Elijah allowed a faint smile. It's not about me. It's about ensuring that people recognize the human element, that every action has weight, that justice isn't just a concept, but a practice we live. Meanwhile, Melissa Carter's journey toward accountability was just beginning. Alone, she contemplated the path ahead, knowing it would involve restitution, introspection, and a confrontation with both personal and systemic failures. The realization was heavy, yet it carried a sliver of possibility, the chance to understand, to grow, and perhaps to rebuild in ways that honored the lessons learned. As night fell over the city, the airport settled into a quieter rhythm. Passengers had dispersed, the crew debriefed, and media coverage continued to pulse online. Elijah remained vigilant, reflecting on the day, aware that while the immediate conflict had concluded, the work of transformation, both personal and institutional, was far from over. The echoes of the day lingered, a testament to the power of moral courage, the weight of accountability, and the profound impact of steadfast composure in moments of crisis. Into boardrooms, classrooms, and homes across the country. The story would be dissected, debated, shared, and remembered not merely as a tale of confrontation, but as a narrative of justice, courage, and systemic awakening. Elijah understood this, and he carried the weight of that awareness with quiet grace. In the days following the incident, the airline moved swiftly. Press releases were issued detailing policy changes, internal investigations were initiated, and staff were required to undergo bias and de-escalation training. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of Elijah, not just for his role as a CEO defending himself, but for the poise, empathy, and strategic insight he displayed. Many passengers and observers noted that the incident could have devolved into chaos, yet it became a lesson in dignity and accountability. Melissa Carter faced her own reckoning. She was suspended pending investigation, and the airline provided her with counseling resources, recognizing that while accountability was necessary, so too was an opportunity for rehabilitation and reflection. She spent long hours alone, revisiting the events, replaying interactions in her mind, questioning every assumption she had made, every subtle decision that had contributed to the incident. For the first time, she confronted the stark reality that authority without empathy was a dangerous thing, and unchecked bias, even subtle or unconscious, could have tangible, destructive consequences. Elijah, meanwhile, balanced his personal reflection with action. He convened an emergency board meeting to ensure that corporate policies were not merely performative, but actionable. Each department head was required to outline concrete steps for embedding fairness, transparency, and accountability into daily operations. Discussions included revising customer service protocols, implementing anonymous reporting mechanisms, and mandating real-time de-escalation training. Elijah emphasized that the lessons from Flight 812 would not fade into the background. They would define the company's ethical compass moving forward. Despite the corporate focus, Elijah never lost sight of the human dimension of the incident. He reached out to passengers personally, thanking them for their composure, their willingness to provide statements, and their trust in the process. Many of these exchanges were brief, but each carried a depth of connection. Elijah understood that leadership was not merely about managing crises, but about human engagement, empathy, and fostering a sense of collective responsibility. At the same time, Elijah reflected privately on the deeper societal implications. He considered the layers of systemic bias, the patterns of privilege, and the ways in which fear and entitlement could manifest even in everyday settings. He wrote notes, drafted speeches, and outlined potential initiatives for community engagement. One idea that resonated deeply was a mentorship program for young Black professionals interested in aviation and corporate leadership, a program designed to offer resources, guidance, and visibility to those often marginalized in these fields. Elijah also thought about resilience, the kind that was quiet, measured, and internal. He recalled the moments mid-flight when his composure had been tested, when every nerve seemed ready to ignite. And yet he had chosen patience, observation, and strategic response. That resilience was not innate. It was cultivated through years of self-awareness, discipline, and reflection. He knew that his example could not simply be a story of one man's dignity, but a blueprint for others navigating oppressive systems. Melissa's own journey paralleled this in a different light. Through therapy and mentorship, she began to understand her missteps not as isolated mistakes, but as the product of a broader culture that had shielded unconscious bias and rewarded rigid adherence to authority. She began to explore accountability beyond the superficial, recognizing that redemption was a slow process requiring both introspection and action. She committed herself to learning, to confronting uncomfortable truths, and to making amends where possible. Meanwhile, media coverage continued to shape public perception. Documentaries, opinion pieces, and social media campaigns dissected the incident, highlighting the courage Elijah displayed and the systemic issues it illuminated. The conversation was no longer about a single altercation, but about broader societal patterns, the ways in which institutions could fail, and the potential for individual action to spark structural change. The viral hashtag associated with the incident trended globally, inspiring similar narratives in other sectors, where marginalized voices demanded recognition and accountability. Elijah, despite his visibility, remained grounded. He spent quiet evenings at home with his partner, reflecting on the events not as a celebrity or a corporate figurehead, but as a human being deeply invested in justice, empathy, and meaningful engagement. These moments were restorative, providing him with clarity, perspective, and the emotional grounding needed to continue leading effectively. The airline's changes were tangible. Bias and de-escalation training became mandatory for all crew. Anonymous reporting channels were implemented for passengers and staff, and a public accountability framework was established. Policy documents were rewritten to emphasize dignity, respect, and fairness. While these steps could not erase the incident, they demonstrated commitment to systemic reform. At the same time, Elijah began speaking publicly at conferences, sharing his experiences, and offering insight into crisis management, ethical leadership, and the importance of upholding human dignity in high-pressure environments. His talks were not simply lectures. They were narratives imbued with personal reflection, emotional authenticity, and practical guidance for others navigating complex social and professional landscapes. As months passed, Melissa Carter's journey of accountability continued. She engaged with diversity and inclusion consultants, participated in educational programs, and volunteered to mentor younger employees. Her transformation was slow and deliberate, marked by moments of frustration, self-doubt, and gradually understanding. She became an advocate for reflective practice within the airline, encouraging her peers to examine their own biases and to approach authority with empathy and critical awareness. Elijah, observing these developments, understood the duality of the human experience: confrontation and resolution, accountability and redemption, pain and growth. He recognized that the flight had been a crucible, not only for himself, but for those around him, revealing the latent tensions and possibilities for change that existed within both individuals and institutions. In the final reflection, Elijah wrote a personal memo to the airline board, summarizing lessons learned, steps taken, and vision forward. His words were measured yet passionate, emphasizing that true leadership required moral courage, systemic thinking, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. He concluded with a statement that would resonate far beyond the company. Change was never instantaneous, but with deliberate action, reflection, and courage, it was possible to build institutions that uplifted rather than diminished, respected rather than oppressed, and inspired rather than intimidated. Months later, as Elijah boarded another flight, He observed the world from a familiar vantage point. The sky was calm, the cabin orderly, and passengers settled. Yet the memory of Flight 812 lingered not as a trauma, but as a lesson, a story of resilience, courage, and the transformative potential of moral clarity. He smiled faintly, recalling the faces of passengers, the subtle nods of empathy, and the knowledge that justice, while sometimes delayed, could indeed prevail. The story of that flight had shifted narratives, reshaped policies, and ignited conversations. It was a testament to the power of individual action within systemic constraints, a reminder that dignity, courage, and strategic moral choice were not abstract ideals, but lived realities that could inspire profound change. And as Elijah looked out at the horizon, he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the turbulence of one moment had sparked the ascent of a broader transformation. Elijah Grant, blackmail CEO and protagonist Melissa Carter, flight attendant involved in the incident, Flight 812, airline flight setting. Additional characters referenced consistently from previous parts. Flight 812 is over, but its lessons linger far beyond the cabin doors. Elijah Grant's experience reminds us that courage is often silent, dignity is often quiet, and justice sometimes requires patience and strategy rather than immediate confrontation. Yet, the incident also exposes the harsh reality of systemic bias and entitlement issues that demand reflection, accountability, and action from all of us. As we close this chapter, we are left with a mix of emotions: admiration for Elijah's strength, empathy for those affected, and outrage toward discriminatory behavior that persists even in places we expect safety and order. But perhaps the most important takeaway is hope. Hope that awareness, courage, and persistent advocacy can transform not only individual lives, but entire institutions. Remember, these stories are not just headlines. They are calls to action, reflections on society, and invitations to stand up for what is right, wherever injustice appears. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more powerful stories that reveal human strength, challenge injustice, and spark conversations that truly matter.